I was doing research for an upcoming video on Project Veritas, one of many on my channel as is quickly becoming the case, and I ended up stumbling across something which completely diverted my attention. As it happens, I was watching InfoWars, a show which is a bit like The View or Loose Women, but for men. This week's episode featured Zach Voorhees, an ex-Google insider who'd been featured in a Project Veritas video, sharing his personal experience of what it had been like to work at Google. I'm going to play you the clip that started it all, the inciting incident that sent me on a journey of intrigue and discovery.
I want to ask a question to the audience. Who is the Tavistock Institute, and what did they have to do with the Beatles?
I had no idea. Who are the Tavistock Institute and what do they have to do with the Beatles? A Google search of the words Tavistock Institute showed me the profile of a fairly unremarkable not-for-profit organisation based in London. But when I went on images, I saw the cover of a book which displayed the title Tavistock Institute, Social Engineering the Masses. So I got the book, I read it from cover to cover, and what I discovered within its pages was a remarkable theory which sought to explain every event of modern human history, from the early 1900s to our present day. It was the story of humans losing their freedom to an elite class of oligarchs who brainwash us every day to stop us learning the truth. And these tyrannical overlords, they'd been behind so much stuff. The counterculture revolution of the 60s, war in Vietnam, Watergate, MTV, Facebook, and yes, the Beatles. By the time I'd finished reading the book, I knew the video I'd been making on Project Veritas would have to wait. A Tavistock video was the one the world urgently needed to see from me. But if you happen to be a big fan of this book and the Tavistock theory in general, I should warn you in advance that you might not like what I have to say, because in spite of the numerous pieces of evidence presented in this book, the further I read, the less convinced I became. This is a video about everything I found wrong with the Tavistock theory as conveyed through this book, and I'll be highlighting the parts where I feel it fails, and fails disastrously at that, to deliver a persuasive and coherent narrative. I'm going to be laying it all out in this video. Tavistock, the Beatles, and beyond. You wanna see how deep the rabbit hole goes? Strap in, home slice. I will begin by telling the story of the Tavistock Institute in a somewhat dramatic reading. Since civilizations began, ordinary people have lived under the foot of tyrannical rulers, kings, emperors, the upper echelons of society. For many years, it was easy for tyrants to impose their will over the common folk through intimidation, but all that started to change around the turn of the 20th century. Literacy rates were up, industrialization had led to widespread prosperity, and a series of revolutions had led the people to realize that they possessed more power and knowledge than their oligarchical overlords. And the overlords knew that their days at the top of the pyramid were numbered. Tyranny by physical intimidation was no longer a viable option. They needed a new way to impose their agenda. Enter the Tavistock Institute, a group of sociopathic scientists who found each other in 1946 and would go on to unlock the secrets of the human brain. In lockstep with the oligarchical elite of the world, the leading scientists of Tavistock, all of them experts in brainwashing, infiltrated major social institutions and started to corrupt them with quack science and poisonous policies, eroding the sovereignty of nations and destroying the traditional family unit. All of our international policy moves, including the wars we fought and died in, were a direct result of their poisonous influence. But one thing proved difficult for Tavistock to corrupt. That was Judeo-Christian culture. The culture was powerful and impervious to attacks from their degeneracy. This is where a second villainous organization enters the picture, a group of radical intellectuals and academics from Germany called the Frankfurt School. While Tavistock applied mass brainwashing techniques from the top, the Frankfurt School would attack the culture of the West from the bottom, corrupting the minds of the young and feeble-minded with naive idealism, sexual perversion, and hedonism. The counterculture, drugs, and free love revolution of the 1960s was a direct result of Tavistock and the Frankfurt School working together. What may have seemed like a spontaneous moment of rebellion amongst America's youth had in fact been meticulously organized by the global elite. The Beatles, Pink Floyd, and the Grateful Dead were all paid CIA stooges. The proliferation of LSD in America was orchestrated by the CIA to cause everyone to lose their grip on reality. The counterculture movement fomented the rise of the New Left, a movement hell-bent on destroying society from within. Over the next 50 years, the Tavistock Institute would pull the strings behind the media, newspapers, radio, TV shows, infantilizing Western viewers and putting them in a constant state of fear and disorientation so that they would allow every last one of their freedoms to be stripped from them. Everything you've ever watched or read has been purposefully crafted to hypnotize you into becoming a slave. The characters you see in kids' TV shows, the symbols you see in pop music videos, all of it is a fabricated reality orchestrated by the elites. After half a century of mass brainwashing and social engineering, the results of the Tavistock Institute's influence on Western society are clear as day. We are divided. Our Judeo-Christian values are no more, and we are weak, servile, and easy to subjugate to whatever cruel and unusual treatment our tyrannical overlords deem appropriate for us. Of course, a psychological operation of this scale leaves a paper trail. There are scientific papers, conference notes, and witnesses who can attest to the truth of what's really going on. But Tavistock and our tyrannical overlords are unconcerned about this. After all, their brainwashing campaign has been so successful that nobody amongst the subservient masses of the world will ever be smart enough to connect the dots. But the Tavistock Institute forgot about one thing.
Daniel Estulin.
Daniel Estulin is a dangerous man to the status quo. Author, broadcaster, investigative journalist, teller of hard truths. In the late 2000s, he pieced together what was going on behind the scenes at Tavistock and made it his life's work to get the truth out there to everyone who he could reach. It's thanks to Daniel Estulin that we have this book, which summarizes much of what is known about the Tavistock theory, delivered in a style which isn't too difficult for the average reader to engage with. The reason why I think Tavistock is the mother of all conspiracy theories is that it seems to be a chimera which amalgamates the threads of every other conspiracy theory I've ever heard about. There are aspects of the Illuminati, the idea that there's an elite group which has all this power, the belief that everything that happens within the world is an inside job. There's a deep suspicion of modern scientists, cultural Marxism via the Frankfurt Boys, a fair bit of evangelism bemoaning satanic influences within our society, and there's also a fair bit of the occult in here, talking about demonic symbols and stuff like that. So this book really does throw everything wide open and reveals every conspiracy theory to be part of a larger, more comprehensive and overarching conspiracy theory. So, that's an explanation of what the Tavistock theory is. The rest of the video will be an explanation of why it's all bullshit. The first thing I noticed as I was reading this book was that Daniel Estulin has a very particular writing style which you don't often see in published books. In fact, I've never seen anyone write like this. He would often quote very long blocks of text, letting the quotations take up whole runs of pages at a time. And as a reader, this makes you feel like you're being told a story by like 10 different narrative voices. To give you an idea of what I mean, take a look at this section. It starts with Estulin introducing someone else's book, then we have 4 pages where we're just hearing from that author. The next little bit, Estulin chips in a paragraph, and then we're back to the same author. Next page, that same author's narrative continues. Next page, no input from Estulin at all, but 5 whole pages of the same quoted author's text, and then Estulin shows up here to write a sentence introducing his next author friend. Then we go into that next author's narrative through to the other side of the spread. In my view, it would have been better for Daniel to simply reference those texts and reformulate the information in his own way. There are 2 very good reasons for doing this. Firstly, it would make the text more cohesive and give the reader a smoother experience as they're going through. But secondly, and I think this is far more important, if Daniel underwent the process of reformulating the arguments of other authors in his own words, it would have forced him to engage more critically with what they were actually saying. Estulin's repurposing of massive passages of text suggests he might not be applying himself in a critical way, and as we're going to see throughout this review, this will bite him in the ass time and time again. Moreover, what became evident to me halfway through reading the book was that Daniel's copy and paste approach to writing was actually indicative of a far worse problem. At one point, he was talking about astrology, and I ended up doing a quick search on the words he'd used and landed on this blog published in 2003, so a good 12 years before Daniel released this book. And to my bamboozlement, I found the passages in Daniel's book had been copied verbatim from this blog. There's a reference number here, this little 65, but that doesn't link to the blog, so what we're looking at here is actually textbook plagiarism. Once I'd found this one example, I grew curious about the rest of Daniel's book, so I started proof-checking random passages as I was going through, and the sheer scope of what I found was really something. Page 54, text copied from an article by Lynn Marcus, no attribution. Page 88, text copied from a book by Peter Lavender, no attribution. Page 94, more text copied from Peter Lavender, no attribution. Is there any plagiarism on this page? Why, yes there is. And this one? Well, yes of course. And what about this one? Well, Daniel has made an effort to change the words a bit here, but the text is still remarkably close to Robert Zubrin's article where the words have been stolen from. And you know, it got to a point where I stopped thinking, am I going to find any more plagiarism? And started thinking, has Daniel Estulin actually written any of this himself? This solidified the sense I already had that there was something fundamentally lacking in Daniel Estulin's critical approach. If you're just copying and pasting other people's work, you're not doing any interrogation of the accuracy of their claims, and you're potentially lazily passing on second-hand misinformation to your readers. And straight off the bat, I can give you two quick examples of this very thing. In one section, Daniel writes about how an educational project called the Columbus Center is a Tavistock Front organization and how it's involved in all these dubious activities. But the thing is, the Columbus Center initiative was disbanded in 1980. So why is Daniel talking about it in the present tense? Well, it's because he's plagiarized the text of an article published in 1974, and 50 years have passed by since then, so the information is outdated and irrelevant. In another section, Daniel writes out this quote by Freud. "The mass has never thirsted for truth," Freud wrote, referring to crowds of raw minds swayed by elementary needs. They demand illusions and cannot do without them. But here's the thing. When Freud wrote this in Mass Psychology, he was merely citing the ideas of another author, Gustave Le Bon, who wrote something very close to that quote Estulin uses 30 years earlier in his book, The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind. So why has Daniel framed this quote as if it's Freud's own? Well, it's because he plagiarized the text from this article written in 1990, which itself incorrectly attributed the quote, and Daniel just trusted their information without reading any of the original source text they were actually referring to. Now, I realize that these criticisms of Daniel's approach to writing are, in and of themselves, not a critique of the Tavistock theory. After all, even if the book is heavily plagiarized, the articles which Daniel is borrowing from might have substantive information to support the whole Tavistock thing being true. However, this does show us, at a very early stage, the sheer lack of intellectual rigor shown by the guy who wrote the theory's most prominent book. At a certain point, I got pretty good at identifying the bits Daniel had written himself, because his style of writing is really distinctive and consists of putting these furious questions to the reader, like he's grilling them in an interrogation room. Like, in this one section, he thinks he can see satanic symbols in Rihanna's music videos, and he's like, or is it Baphomet's head? Are we hallucinating? Is it trick photography? And if it isn't, then what's it doing there? In another section, he's talking about subconscious messages being placed in TV programs. Why is it being done? To dumb you down, to brainwash you, to turn you into a touchy-feely adult with infantile tendencies so you don't get in the way of important people doing too much thinking on your own. Think about it. And near the end of the book, Daniel is talking about the brainwashing of children, and he asks, how many people realize that the Mickey Mouse Club was a sinister experiment in mass brainwashing of children through television? How many people realize that while they were giving their Mouseketeer salute, they were actually being fed a new pagan-like religion and its newly installed god, the mouse? Mickey Mouse and Hitler, can you see a parallel?
Do you see? Do you see?
A final thing which I wanted to mention before we dive into our critique of the theory is the references in this book. There are 394 overall, but the vast majority of those link to publications such as Executive Intelligence Review, The Campaigner, and The New Federalist, which are all owned by the recently deceased Lyndon LaRouche. LaRouche was a well-known polemicist in the late 1900s with a whole cadre of followers known as the LaRouche movement. And although as far as I can tell, they always had a reputation for engaging in conspiracy theories, they came close to gaining real political power in America on a few occasions, with several of LaRouche's followers winning primaries in state elections in the 80s, and Lyndon himself receiving 5% of the nationwide vote for the American presidency in 1996. This video is not about the LaRouche movement, but it's interesting to know that by engaging with Daniel Estulin's Tavistock book, we're mostly going to be responding to claims which were made by the men, women, and children of the LaRouche movement over 20 years ago. Let's start by talking about characterization. Whenever Daniel introduces someone new to the text, he immediately assigns them a pejorative label. And this is especially true of people who are members of the Tavistock Institute. Kurt Lewin, one of the founders of pop psychology, is introduced to the text as someone who has no political differences from Hitler, despite him being a Jew who had to flee from Germany during the Second World War. John Rawlings Rees, the head of the Tavistock Institute, is described as the Grandmaster of Psy-War, and Eric Trist, another Tavistock researcher, is described as a Rockefeller-sponsored Reesian fascist. Of course, this name-calling alone would not be sufficient to convince readers of Tavistock's inner fascism, so Daniel then presents direct quotations from speeches, essays, and research papers which these individuals have published, and holds these up to his audience to show that all the negative characterizations he makes are justified. In the opening section of the book, Daniel establishes the head of the Tavistock Institute, John Rawlings Rees, as someone who opposes the interests of the working class and wants to see them subjugated to his authority. Daniel writes that Rees believed there must be a complete transformation of society according to rational selection, and includes a quote from Rees's book where Rees laments that workers don't see reality his way. Daniel goes on to assert that Rees must think that anyone who disagrees with his elitist worldview is neurotic and mentally ill. Let's begin by dissecting the quote Daniel features here, and we will immediately unearth a deceptive feature of Daniel's approach in general. The first part of the quote, which is written here, "Many don't see reality this way, including most workers who believe," those are not words that John Rawlings Rees has ever said or written. We can look back at the article Daniel plagiarized this from and see the words Daniel featured in his book are the pontificating meanderings of a random LaRouche journalist, not John Rees himself. What Daniel Estulin has done is taken the words of the LaRouche journalist, put them in quotes, and then dishonestly presented it to his readers as if it's a direct quote from John Rees. The rest of the quote is real. It's from a passage in Rees's book where Rees is describing some psychometric tests which he devised for the British Army during World War II, which ended up being used for the selection of officers. Rees writes that although there is a feeling abroad that any method of selection is part of an evil capitalist plan to get more out of workers, his main concern is just making sure that individuals in the army are given jobs which they are suited to, that allow them to have greater happiness and better health. In fact, John Rees's psychometric tests allowed more working class soldiers than ever before to become officers, because now they were being tested on aptitude alone rather than being judged on their social class, which had previously been the case. So, to summarize, John Rees's quote was mischaracterized by a LaRouche journalist, but still correctly attributed as far as where they placed their quotation marks. But Daniel Estulin has wholesale fabricated a fake John Rawlings Rees quote to make his readers believe that John Rees was voicing disdain for the working class, when in fact Rees's actual quote had nothing at all to do with the working class. For most non-fiction authors, a mistake of this magnitude would be mortifying, and I imagine they'd be falling over themselves to issue a retraction. However, in Daniel Estulin's book, the fabrication of quotes is such a constant, shameless feature that it's clear that this is a deliberate tactic. Daniel quotes Gustave Le Bon saying that people in crowds lose their inhibitions and moral standards, and that man has returned to his animal roots. Gustave Le Bon never said or wrote any of these sentences. It's a LaRouche journalist's personal interpretation of what his work secretly means. In Theodore Adorno's essay, Introduction to the Sociology of Music, we're told that there's a quote about programming a mass culture as a form of extensive social control. But again, the Adorno quote doesn't exist. Daniel has copied and pasted other people's words and dishonestly presented it as a direct quote from Adorno. Tavistock researchers called Tristan Emery said, "Such a group becomes easy to control and will docilely follow orders without rebelling." No, they never said this or wrote anything like this. Those are words which Daniel has stolen from John Coleman, and Coleman himself isn't even trying to attach the quote to Trist and Emery. Daniel plants another quote from Tristan Emery on the next page about repressing reality. It's also fake. Daniel even attributes a false quote to Carl Jung, one of the most widely read psychoanalysts of all time. How on earth does Daniel expect his work to be of any value if he's not responding to things people have actually ever said or written? Imagine if my critique of Daniel's book consisted of me making up quotes Daniel said and then responding to those fake quotes. "Society can only thrive if the working class eat their own feces," writes Daniel Estulin. Daniel, that's disgusting. People deserve to eat food, you wicked man. What would be the point of doing that? It's so stupid. So, to sum up, Daniel's characterization of Tavistock figures and other prominent intellectuals who he sees as being part of their brainwashing agenda consists of 1. Calling them names, and then 2. Making up fake quotes they never wrote or said. This is not a very convincing strategy for readers such as myself, who would like to see a bit more evidence than name-calling and lies. Next up, we're going to talk about an issue with the Tavistock theory, which really gets to the core of what's wrong with most conspiracy theories, and this is false conclusions being drawn from wild interpretations of fairly unremarkable stuff. Like any polemicist, Daniel often works from real documents and true events, but then jumps to some mad conclusion. My approach in this section is largely going to consist of giving details and context, which make a lot of Daniel's fanciful extrapolations untenable. In the first section of the book, Daniel talks about the Tavistock Institute having a fascistic plan to drive Western populations to psychosis through the use of radical disruption and shock troops, and he says that they're going to force everyone to have mental treatment against their will, effectively foreshadowing the secret Tavistock mass brainwashing plan, which is the premise of the whole book. He presents 3 pieces of evidence for this. Firstly, a quote from John Rawlings Rees, where Rees talks about deploying shock troops all over the nation. Secondly, a quote from Rees saying that Tavistock will give treatment to people from every social group even when they do not wish it. And thirdly, a document from Tavistock's research unit outlining a plan to deliver a series of psychological shocks to the nation so that everyone becomes unable to make their own choices. Let's go through these one by one. Firstly, quote-unquote shock troops are a real thing that John Rees referred to in his book, The Shaping of Psychiatry by War. Reading this now in the modern era, I can see why, to people like Daniel, that term would sound suspicious. However, from reading other historical sources, what becomes clear is that Tavistock's main role in the war was treating shell shock victims, soldiers who'd been exposed to bombardments on the front lines for prolonged periods of time. After the war, these shell-shocked soldiers went back to their homes all over the country, and thus it was necessary for Tavistock to deploy shock troops all over the nation to treat them. Next, let's talk about the quote Daniel uses where Rees wants to treat people even when they do not wish it. If you read Rees's book, you see that this quote has been taken dramatically out of context. Rees is specifically talking about mentally ill patients who need urgent psychiatric care. If you've had a family or friend who's been through a psychotic episode, then you'll understand that when people are in this state, they usually don't want to be treated, but leaving them untreated means they might hurt themselves or someone else, thus the need to give them treatment even when they do not wish it. John Rees specifies in the very next sentence from the one that Daniel has put in his book that his statement concerns psychotic and defective persons. Finally, regarding the document Daniel refers to, which outlines a plan to deliver psychological shocks to the nation, this information has come from a book by John Coleman. And in that book, Coleman says, "That is Tavistock jargon lifted straight from Tavistock manuals, which they don't know I have." So unfortunately, I can't check those documents because Coleman does not appear to have uploaded them anywhere on the internet, meaning that, to the best of my research, he remains the only person to have seen them. The next pillar of Daniel Estulin's evidence against Tavistock is their 1948 International Mental Health Conference, where Tavistock specifically outlined a sinister plan to create a new world order. Daniel points his readers towards a speech that John Rawlings Rees gave to open the conference, authored by 2 other Tavistock members called Mead and Fremont Smith. Daniel pulls out this quote where Rees talks about his desire to create healthy personalities for a healthy society and asserts that the concept of mental health is coextensive with world order and world community. What Daniel infers from this is that Tavistock are openly declaring their plan to take over and impose a new world order. But a slightly longer quote from the same speech shows the term world order is not used here in the sense of a new ruling system, but rather in the sense of a world with order rather than chaos, a world not at war. The sciences of man offer the hope of a new approach to the problem of war and a world community. It is the ultimate goal of mental health to help men live with their fellows in one world. The world community that must be developed so that men can live together in peace with each other. Next, Daniel says that part of Rees's speech is a plan to set up a system of community mental health clinics where psychiatrists will forcibly deliver therapy to large population groups. But although it looks like Daniel is quoting John Rees directly here, this is just another example of Daniel copying and pasting the writing of a LaRouche journalist who is guessing at the secret hidden meanings behind Rees's speech without grounding their text in anything Rees actually said. After all that, we get to some evidence which is more compelling. Daniel raises that Tavistock stressed the need of placing psychiatrists in key positions and infiltrating social institutions. This actually does map onto something that happened in real life. Here, I have Rees's Strategic Planning for Mental Health speech, delivered at a mental hygiene conference in 1940. I've seen this being used on the internet as a red pill for people who are new to the Tavistock theory, and I can see why it's persuasive. In this speech, Rees specifically talks about the need to infiltrate social organizations and says that Tavistock has already had great success doing this in schools and the church. That sounds awfully shady. What does that mean? Well, the mental hygiene movement, which Tavistock was part of, substantially altered prevalent ways of thinking about mental health in education and church groups in the early 20th century. The way that the mental hygiene movement infiltrated schools and churches was by distributing 98,000 books and pamphlets about the importance of mental health. They also gave frequent lectures and seminars and sponsored summer training courses for teachers. When Rees said that his organization had successfully infiltrated schools and churches, their teacher training and pamphlet campaign was what he was talking about. Tavistock's campaign encouraged teachers to be less harsh and authoritarian, urged them to be more attentive to the emotional well-being of children in their classes, and also to be aware of their own mental well-being as teachers and not take their problems out on the children they taught. Is this what the imposition of fascism looks like? Making teachers be nicer to kids? Because I think many people would agree that slapping kids across the face to make them learn harder wasn't our best idea. Now let's move on to Daniel's claims about the CIA and FBI. The first claim to be addressed is the notion that the FBI was paying rock and roll groups such as the Grateful Dead. Daniel references an FBI internal memo from 1968 describing how the Grateful Dead were being used as an avenue to channel young people into drugs and mysticism instead of politics. Obviously, I was intrigued to see this memo, but to my disappointment, Daniel didn't link to it. Instead, he links the reader to a book by Jim Keith called Mind Control, World Control. So we open up Jim Keith's book to see where he got this information from, and we see that Jim Keith links to another book by Carol White called The New Dark Ages Conspiracy. So we open up Carol White's book, and to our increasing disappointment, we find that although it mentions the Grateful Dead and Jerry Garcia, the band's frontman, there is absolutely no mention of that 1968 FBI memo in here. Through doing my own search, I did find the Grateful Dead mentioned in FBI documents, but the documents in question came from the Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs Unit and label the Grateful Dead as a possible drug smuggling operation, and they also state, it would appear that this is a rock group of some sort, which seems odd coming from the people who supposedly put them up to do this whole music thing. On the subject of the Beatles, one of Daniel Estulin's reliable sources, John Coleman, states that Frankfurt School academic Theodore Adorno, who was 60 years of age when the Beatles rose to prominence, wrote all of the Beatles' music and lyrics. Now this is a claim which is extraordinary, because writing the Beatles' music wouldn't even be like writing the music of most other bands. We're talking about a discography that spans 12 conceptually and sonically distinct studio albums using pioneering production methods, one of which was released after Theodore Adorno was dead. And not only that, within each album, we have the distinct songwriting styles of Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison and Ringo Starr, with each member of the band having different stylistic tendencies. Whilst I cannot refute the claim that Frankfurt School member Theodore Adorno wrote all of the Beatles' music, I feel like the onus really needs to be on the person making this claim to provide sufficiently compelling evidence for it rather than me searching around for the opposite. The other claim Daniel makes about the CIA is that working on behalf of the Tavistock Institute, they distributed and popularized LSD amongst the American population to catalyze the counterculture revolution of the 70s. Regarding Daniel's claim that the CIA were the ones who proliferated LSD in America, there's a problem with the timeline he presents to his readers. In 1947, before the CIA ever got wind of what LSD was, the Swiss chemists who discovered the drug were offering it free of charge to research institutes around the world because they wanted as many people as possible doing studies on it and sharing their data. Remember that at this point, the word hallucinogenic didn't even exist. It wasn't even part of our vocabulary. Scientists were looking to LSD as a novel trial drug which might help them learn more about schizophrenia, which they thought the drug simulated a mild version of. LSD subsequently arrived in the US not via the CIA, but via a Viennese doctor named Otto Kauders in 1949. For a good 15 years, there were no laws against LSD, and research institutes were free to do whatever they wanted with it. So you can imagine how quickly people around the US started catching on to what is objectively the best drug ever invented. It's also around this part of Daniel Estulin's Tavistock book that he starts tripping over himself with all the threads of different conspiracy theories he's trying to spin. At the same time as he's claiming that Tavistock and the CIA proliferated LSD in American society, he's also telling his readers that Tavistock and the Frankfurt School controlled all forms of media and were using television television and newspapers to push their agenda. The problem with these two conspiracy theories butting heads is that it doesn't make sense with the patterns which we can observe in the media of the 1960s. Looking through old articles from the New York Times, you can see a sustained fear-mongering campaign to get LSD banned, with every LSD incident that occurred being purposefully and systematically amplified to put another nail in the coffin of the hippies who were frequent LSD users. So if we're to grant the premises of the things Daniel has claimed, then the Tavistock Institute were both trying to proliferate LSD around the country via the CIA and at the same time pushing for it to be banned via the media. That's bad project management skills. There are other timeline issues in this book. Daniel claims the interpretive survey methodology of public opinion polls was invented by the Frankfurt School as a method of public brainwashing. But we've been publishing public opinion polls since 1902, when the members of the Frankfurt School were all small children. Daniel claims that Kurt Lewin worked closely with the US government on Project MKUltra during the Cold War, but Kurt Lewin died in February 1947 before the Cold War begun and 6 years before Operation MKUltra was given the go-ahead. The final misrepresentation, which I'll cover in this section, but by no means the final one in the book, is Daniel's assertion that Tavistock are anti-science and don't want humanity to progress and make scientific discoveries. In order to substantiate this, Daniel highlights a quote from a report published in 1972 by an NGO called the Club of Rome, which says this: "In search for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself." The inference that Daniel makes from this quote is that the problems of global warming, water shortages, and famine have all been made up by the Tavistock Institute and the global elite to stop humanity from industrializing and progressing. However, Daniel's conclusion is undermined by other things written in the very same report he's citing to make this point. The report doesn't mince its words in stating that the exploitation of nature is destroying our planet. The reason why the report decides to theorize environmental problems as a common enemy of humanity is because, as it explains, humanity has never lived without enemies, and usually those enemies have been rival nations. The report argues that it would be far better to make enemies out of problems that threaten the whole human race, such as pollution, water shortage, unemployment, etc., than making enemies out of rival nations. Also, I find it funny how Daniel writes that by citing this one quote from a 160-page report, he's managed to break through the Babylonian verbal confusion of the report's authors, making the reader feel as though he's undergone some rigorous, scholarly analysis of the report's contents, rather than the, in my opinion, far more likely tale that Daniel saw this quote on the internet on one of the many blogs published before his book came out and didn't ever bother to see what else the Club of Rome report had to say. In a last-ditch attempt to prove that Tavistock are against humans progressing in science, Daniel makes a laughably stupid and easily disprovable claim towards the end of his book, which we must talk about because it's so funny. Daniel writes that astronauts went to space in the 1960s, and this made ordinary people in America really interested in becoming scientists. And because Tavistock are so elitist and they really hate the masses educating themselves, Tavistock published an article in their journal Human Relations in Alarm saying, "Stop becoming scientists, everyone. There will soon be 2 scientists for every man, woman and dog in the society." So the first question you should be asking yourself here is, has Daniel accurately characterized this quote? And the answer is no. The quote is taken from this text, which merely summarizes that the number of scientists has been growing exponentially over the past 250 years, but such exponential growth cannot physically continue because it would literally be impossible. It would be impossible for the number of scientists to outnumber the number of men, women, children, and dogs. That cannot physically happen, so any models predicting that growth to continue are wrong. The text is in no way, shape, or form trying to discourage people from becoming scientists. In fact, it says that having a bigger number of scientists working on the same stuff is actually a good thing, as it means that there's a natural self-checking process to all the research being done. But what pushes this into the absurd is the fact that this text is not from Tavistock's journal, Human Relations. This is from a book called Little Science, Big Science by Derek J. de Sola Price. And Sola Price has nothing to do with the Tavistock Institute. He's just a historian of science writing about contemporary trends. So, to recap what happened here, Daniel took a quote from a random author discussing the rising number of scientists in Western society and used that to conclude that Tavistock, people who had nothing to do with this text or this quote, must be angry at the number of people educating themselves and wanting to go to space. And you know, the saddest thing about this is that Daniel is probably not even aware of how dumb this all is. This all happened because Daniel read a LaRouche article from 2007 by Marsha Freeman, which told the same lie, and Daniel, trusting Marsha without checking her sources, thought, well, that sounds perfect for my book, I'll plagiarize that. And bless him, he's now inadvertently put his name to one of the stupidest claims in published literature. What I've been trying to get across in this section is that Daniel's theories about key events in the history of the Tavistock Institute are very poorly thought through and do not stand up to scrutiny. Their believability hinges on readers being completely oblivious to the history of events Daniel is describing, and additionally, the sheer amount of conspiracy theories Daniel frantically reaches for over the course of his book ultimately end up undermining his central points, because they can't logically all be true at the same time. One thing which occurred to me as I was reading Daniel Estulin's book is that the social scientists who work for the Tavistock Institute are not the first people I'd have picked to center my conspiracy theory around. Conspiracy theories rely on there being enough unexplained gaps and mystery surrounding people that you can throw some shit at them and no one can know for sure whether you're wrong. The founders of the Tavistock Institute and the Frankfurt School, on the other hand, were very prominent academics in their time who published countless papers and books and were known by pretty much everyone in their field. So if you were to make odd claims about them, and in particular their academic research, anyone with the internet could go and look at their published stuff and instantly know how out of your depth you are. In particular, if I was Daniel Estulin, i.e. someone who doesn't read source materials, I would stay well away from making any claims about research done by the Tavistock Institute or essays published by the Frankfurt School, because I'd be so worried about embarrassing myself and looking like an idiot. But, as it turns out, Daniel is a man with cojones which are inversely proportional to the size of his ability as a journalist, and he not only boldly makes claims about research he hasn't read, but he does it in almost every section of the book. Let's start with Daniel's thoughts on Kurt Lewin. Lewin was the first to realise through close observation of his tested cadres that the imposition of fascist-like forms of small group organisation and corporatist structural reforms could induce fascist ideology in a subject population. And now we can go and look for ourselves at some of these fascist experiments that Lewin conducted. On one occasion, Kurt Lewin got his students to fill out questions on an exam paper and then ask them which questions they could recall the best, and he found out that they could recall the ones which were difficult more than the ones which were easy. Fuck, that's so fascistic. In another experiment, Kurt Lewin got students to throw hoops over pegs on the ground and asked them how many out of 10 they thought they could get. When the task was done, he got them to predict if they could increase their score. What a psychopath. How did he get away with it without getting reported to the police? So, irony done, all of Kurt Lewin's research is published. He was doing basic bitch, boring social psychology experiments. Daniel is not just incorrect, he's absolutely lost, and it shows. But, you might say, what about Kurt Lewin's theories? After all, that is what Lewin is better known for. Maybe that's where the secret fascism is. And this is where we can tag in the LaRouche journalists who Daniel plagiarized from. In their piece, they write, a large number of influential people at the top policy level were trained in Dr. Lewin's theory of topological psychology, which is, to this day, the world's most advanced method of behavior modification, brackets, brainwashing. So, the world's most advanced method of brainwashing is Lewin's theory of topological psychology, which handily he published in a public book in 1936 for the whole world to read. Let's open up a review of the book and see how scientists reacted to this revelation at the time. This is what they wrote. It is the conclusion of this reviewer that topological psychology is not yet even the hope of a science. Kurt Lewin's theory of topological psychology is not the world's most advanced method of brainwashing. It's a book where Lewin attempted to apply a constructive mathematical procedure to explain the relationship between psychological processes and behavior, and the results weren't that compelling, leading to all of his peers mercilessly roasting him one by one. One scholar said, Lewin strode a gigantic misstep in formalizing his system in ugly topological pseudopods. His tool was inadequate to its task. Another academic hit Lewin with this. Lewin contends that his topology provides the basis for a truly scientific psychology, but many feel that it's merely a novel but cumbersome way of picturing simple psychological situations. Needless to say, scientist number 1 and 2 got sprayed off the face of the earth once Kurt's secret plan of fascism kicked in. One of two things is possible here. Either Kurt Lewin's theory of topological psychology is the world's most advanced form of brainwashing, but every scientist who read it has missed this and just thinks it's a clumsy and ineffectual way of explaining social psychology. Or the LaRouche movement and Daniel Estulin are so desperate to find something to pin on Lewin to make him seem like a fascist that they have to resort to making up lies about what his research was actually about. Next up, Daniel is going to attempt to analyze Fred Emery's book, Futures We Are In. Daniel describes Emery as Tavistock's leading media expert. He's the lead brainwasher in charge of the societal transformation which Tavistock have planned. So as you can imagine, we're about to learn a lot about how Daniel thinks the mass brainwashing process will occur. Daniel's analysis unfortunately starts off poorly, as he attributes 2 quotes to Emery that haven't come from his book. When Daniel actually starts talking about what's in the book, what becomes clear is that Daniel doesn't look at it as a theoretical text, but rather Emery telegraphing Tavistock's secret plan to brainwash Western society. Obviously, Emery is so arrogant and confident that Tavistock will get away with what they're doing that Emery has no problem publishing everything about it in academic journals. Daniel says that the book reveals how Tavistock plans to create social turbulence to force society to undergo 3 stages of development. In the first stage, society will become infantilized and animal-like. In the second stage, society's ethnic, racial, and sexual groups will start fighting each other, and a Big Brother-style surveillance regime will take over. And in the third stage, society will become a Nazi regime. For Daniel, this is, in real life, where Western society is heading under Tavistock's secret plan. The way that most scholars interpret Emery's thesis is by looking at the words Emery actually wrote, rather than extrapolating secret prophetic meanings from them. However, even if we were to look at Emery's thesis as a grim prophecy, Daniel has got so many basic details of it fundamentally wrong. Emery theorizes that most modern societies are, by definition, turbulent societies, given that they are richly textured with constantly evolving demands which require adaptive decision-making from people who live within them. So already, Daniel's claim of this text prophesizing that social turbulence will at some point be created is completely wrong. According to Emery's definitions, societies have already been turbulent for hundreds and hundreds of years, given that this is how long we've had institutions and organizations that all push for their own forms of social change. Daniel's understanding of humanity going through 3 stages of hellish developments is also based on poor comprehension of the text. Emery doesn't hypothesize that society will go through 3 stages, but rather that society may end up in one of 3 bad scenarios based on how they respond to turbulence, and he names well-known works of literature to help the reader visualize how these worst-case scenarios might manifest themselves. The first response society might have is superficiality, promoting surface conformity amongst everyone, which negates individuality. The second response society might have is segmentation, dividing themselves up into different interest groups, and Orwell's 1984 is named as an illustrative example of what this could ultimately look like. The third response society might have is dissociation, where everyone retreats into their own private worlds and finds small comforts for themselves. Within Emery's theory, society can't go from the worst case scenario of one response to the worst case of another in the way that Daniel Estulin claims, because each scenario is fueled by society acting in fundamentally different ways. Daniel also shows lack of text comprehension when he writes that Emery prophesized that people would become maladaptive. This doesn't even make sense. Maladaptive isn't ever used to describe people in Emery's text. It's an adjective which means the opposite of adaptive and describes inanimate nouns such as strategies, methods, and responses. The way Daniel has interpreted this text as a prophetic 3-stage of hell thing that Emery wants to impose on Western society, I mean, how do I respond to this? Does Daniel read the work of Isaac Newton and think Newton was secretly planning to impose gravity on all of us? No, he was making a theory about something which he believed was already there. You could apply Daniel's weird interpretation method to any literary text. Midsummer Night's Dream could be Shakespeare revealing his secret plan to knock everyone out with sleep magic so we wake up and fall in love with each other's partners. The Life of Pi, obviously Jan Martel's secret plan to destroy the family unit by making us all go out and make friends with tigers instead of starting families. But even beyond the stupidity of interpreting texts in this prophetic pseudo-religious framework, it's obvious that Daniel hasn't even understood the fundamentals of Emery's theory in the first place. So even if Tavistock's secret plan was in there, Daniel would be getting it all wrong when trying to inform his readers about what it is. Tavistock scientists would be like, oh shit, we've been rumbled. No way, even though our whole secret plan is in this book, Daniel Estulin hasn't comprehended anything we wrote and is actually providing a good smokescreen now for us. And you simply must hear Daniel Estulin's perspectives on Theodor Adorno's culture essays. Daniel writes that drug counterculture was precisely the weapon the Frankfurt School was looking for, and that they used it to transform American culture into a perverse and degenerate, horrible thing. And then Daniel writes this. In his 1948 work on the philosophy of modern music, Frankfurt School leader Theodor Adorno argued that the purpose of modern music is to literally drive the listener insane. He justified this by asserting that modern society was a hotbed of evil authoritarianism and potential fascism, and that only by first destroying civilization through the spread of all forms of cultural pessimism and perversity could liberation occur. Daniel's summary of Adorno's essay is wrong, it's unsubstantiated, and like many other parts of his book, it ends up undermining the larger point he's trying to make, tying the Frankfurt School to the 60s counterculture revolution. Theodor Adorno's Philosophy of Modern Music, written in 1949, is explicitly an essay about the music of Arnold Schoenberg, a composer who was groundbreaking in his experimentation with atonality, meaning he made musical pieces with no traditional key or tonal center, two conventions which Western society had long assumed to be mandatory in classical composition. He was like the aphex twin of the interwar period. In his essay, Adorno argued that tonal classical music had become so embedded in Western society that people perceived it as an object of home decoration rather than an art form. And as a result, people had become accustomed to avoiding critical engagement with music in general, making it into background entertainment. By contrast, Schoenberg's atonal music, with its rejection of conventions the listener was expecting, literally forced engagement from people, and was therefore, in the eyes of Theodor Adorno at least, a higher art form of music. I think anyone who listens to stuff like grindcore or esoteric forms of electronic music can understand this argument. There's music that's not conventionally nice to listen to for most people, but therein lies its whole appeal. Regarding Daniel Estulin's reading of this text, that Adorno wanted to spread serialist music to destroy Western culture, I mean, Adorno is just talking about music. It's not that deep. He's not saying, we can use this crazy music to collapse the government and rah rah rah. He's just vibing to his favourite artist. And Daniel's total ignorance of what's actually written in this text becomes glaringly apparent when Daniel uses it as a basis to claim that the 60s counterculture revolution was the cultural change Adorno wanted to see. You see, Adorno's criticism wasn't just against classical music, but against harmony in general. He hated the pop music that young people listened to and what he called the sleek statistical procedures of the hit tune industry. Is Daniel really trying to argue that Theodor Adorno, who hated music which was defined by the constant repetition of very few chords, found what he was looking for in the music of the Grateful Dead? If you put together everything that Adorno said he hated about music in his essay, the fact that it's mass-produced, the fact that listeners aren't critically engaged, the fact that the harmonies and chords are so mind-numbingly simple and repetitive, all those things could have been specifically written about the counterculture music of the 60s. If you want to force a link between the Frankfurt School and the 60s counterculture revolution, don't do it on the basis of Adorno's taste in music, you fool. That's just about the stupidest, most self-defeating argument you could have made. Undeterred by his lack of comprehension skills, Daniel dives headfirst into another critique of Adorno's scholarship, and this time he misses even harder. Daniel explains to his readers that Adorno wrote that he could use television to make people retarded. Well, we know you can do it with a book. Daniel also writes that Adorno said television was a medium of undreamed of psychological control, and that creative sissies would find a very important place in Western society. These extrapolations originate from, although in no way accurately reflect, Adorno's essay, Television and the Patterns of Mass Culture. First of all, there's 2 quotes down here, which Daniel has fabricated. There's no talk of brainwashing in Adorno's essay. That's a LaRouche journalist guessing at his hidden meaning again. The quote saying, television is a medium of undreamed of psychological control is also a fabrication, but this time it's the original LaRouche journalist who Daniel plagiarized from who did the fabricating. The correct quote from Adorno is that all modern culture is a medium of psychological control. It appears the journalist has edited it to say television to better suit their narrative. Adorno does not say that creative sissies are going to rise up in society. He talks about the fact that artists on TV are often portrayed as weaklings, sissies, and homosexuals, which isn't representative of reality because anyone could be an artist. Does Adorno argue that he can use TV to make people retarded? No. He says that people need to be aware of the subconscious messages in television shows so that we don't become passive victims to them, a point which I'm pretty sure is the foundation of Daniel's whole conspiracy theory. So Daniel might actually enjoy Adorno's essay and agree with a lot of it if he would only read.
Damn it, why won't it read?
So, each academic text referenced in Daniel Estulin's book is a dangerous landmine which threatens to destroy his whole credibility, and yet he so willingly throws himself onto each and every one of them that you have to wonder what goes through his head when he writes these things. Texts are misunderstood, they are irrationally interpreted as people telegraphing secret fascist plans when they're just writing academic theories. But the biggest problem of all is that Daniel shows no interest in reading the very texts that are the foundation of his conspiracy theory. If he did that, he could at least make up more believable stuff about what's in them, but his whole approach is just so lazy. Before we finish up, there's a final underpinning argument I want to deal with. Although Daniel's writing style revolves mostly around sequentially jumping from one piece of evidence to the next and angrily demanding questions of his audience, there is one argument that Daniel frequently returns to, and this is the mantra that humans need to depart from the path we're going down and get back to real rationality and science. But what's confusing all the way through Daniel's book is that almost no precision is given over what quote-unquote real science should be. Daniel makes clear that he thinks the social sciences are pseudoscience, astrobiology is touchy-feely environmental irrationalism, psychoanalysis is Freudian claptrap, cybernetics is a sinister attack on the epistemology responsible for mankind's development and survival. The vast majority of scientists brought up in the book are described as kooks, and isn't it strange that Daniel would describe Tavistock's research as pseudoscience, because isn't the whole premise of the book that Tavistock successfully used it to brainwash the whole of Western society, so isn't he undermining the whole point of his conspiracy theory here? Anyway, I didn't think Daniel was going to get around to articulating his own vision for what science should be, beyond the vague abstract suggestion of real science existing somewhere but humans being blind to follow it because we've been brainwashed and all that stuff. But then I got to the final section of Daniel's book, and I had the pleasure of reading Daniel attempting to define what quote-unquote real science should be, and it's exactly as enlightened as you'd imagine. The essence of science are the methods by which discoveries are made, called the method of hypothesis, developed in ancient Greece. The core of this method is the belief that the laws of the development of the universe are coherent with the human mind's own notion of lawfulness, so that the truth of the universe is fundamentally knowable to man. Daniel then disparages Aristotle, by contrast, for breaking the universe down into a collection of objects and assuming that ideas occur in a space devoid of reality. So Daniel's synopsis of what science should be, on the face of it, appears to be an embrace of Plato's rationalism and a rejection of Aristotle's empiricism. The first and most obvious thing to notice is that for someone who laments the use of quote-unquote Babylonian verbal confusion by other authors, Daniel sure can construct a turd sandwich of a sentence himself. The way he's put this argument is stupidly overcomplex for the simple idea he's trying to get across, and as you might have guessed, the reason for the wordiness of this passage is because it's copied and pasted from parts of a LaRouche article Daniel has read, and he's just sort of rammed bits of this article together, making whatever argument existed in the former piece lose all of its coherency and flow. Let's just deal with this argument as if Daniel made it himself. It's really odd that after decrying so many forms of modern science throughout his book, Daniel goes all the way back to ancient Greece to pull out some supposed essence of what science is supposed to be. Science as we think of it today has moved on so much from everything that was written back in ancient Greece that the comparison is stupid on the face of it. However, ironically, of all the people writing back then in those times, Aristotle, who Daniel randomly disparages, was the closest to developing the modern scientific method we use now. The idea of empiricism, piling small observations of objects, one on top of the other, and using the cumulative knowledge of all those things to identify trends, that's how we got to all the best scientific discoveries of the last 250 years. It's fascinating that Daniel presumably has all these readers nodding along with his points about his ideological adversaries being unscientific and irrational, and then we get to this end bit of the book and find out that Daniel all along had no idea what modern science actually was. I would really enjoy it if we could all start a GoFundMe and get Daniel sent to some kind of science conference and watch him explain to scientific researchers that what they do is a betrayal of the essence of science. You see, instead of doing empirical studies on all these different objects, you guys should just assume the truth of the universe is fundamentally knowable to man. They'd all be like, what? What science do you study? Another question which occurred to me all the way through the book was, if Tavistock are so powerful and in control of all of our information sources and media, why on earth would they publish all the details of their secret plans to take over society in public documents and journals and stuff in a way which is so obvious that someone as vapid as Daniel Estulin can put it all together? Well, Daniel has anticipated such an argument and he writes a response. He explains, "The truth of the matter is that secret societies love to hide things in plain sight." So that's that loose end tied up. Now, there is plenty more to critique in Daniel Estulin's book, but I realised quite soon into doing my research that if I responded to each and every point in this video, I would quickly end up with a video of a length that I'm convinced even Mawless fans wouldn't be able to watch, so I think we're going to have to draw the line here. To sum up what I believe are the core problems with Daniel's book: 1. Almost the entire thing is plagiarised, with Daniel not having checked the validity of any of the claims made by his source text, or having even read the source text. 2. People are labelled as fascists based on fabricated quotes, which Daniel knocks together from LaRouche journalist mischaracterizations and dishonestly presents them to his audience as if they've come direct from the sources, which again, he hasn't read. 3. False narratives are spun by omitting historical context through the submission of offhanded quotes and isolated lines of text from random speeches. 4. Author is woefully ill-equipped to deal with academic theories and principles, and Daniel treats them as if they're biblical prophecies or tarot cards, an approach by which one could get literally any meaning out of any text. 5. Constant appeals made to science without any understanding of what the modern scientific method is, as demonstrated by Daniel's strange appeals to the ancient Greeks at the end of the book. In spite of these problems, which I do think are serious enough to shoot some big holes in the Tavistock conspiracy theory for any rational thinker, there's a particular reason why I've titled my video a critique rather than Tavistock theory debunked. And the reason is, I'm doubtful that you ever really can debunk conspiracy theories like this one. However many explanations can be offered to demystify the evidence which is presented so mysteriously, without context and without even the most basic knowledge of surrounding issues in the book, the art of the conspiracy theorist lies in always finding a next quote, event or phenomenon, which the skeptic must further explain. Even if the skeptic manages to shoot through 100 of the conspiracy theorist pieces of evidence, the theorist can stand atop his turd of a book and still declare that the fact the skeptic is trying to obliterate his turd is further evidence of the righteousness of said turd. There is actually a brilliant defense that Tavistock conspiracy theorists can clap back at this video with, and that is to decry Daniel Estulin as a random fool whose book is in no way representative of their Tavistock movement. You know, the Tavistock theory is real, but the way Daniel presented it is very stupid, and the real evidence can only be found elsewhere. To which I would say, okay, get writing a new book that has the good stuff in it, guys. As for Daniel Estulin, the best defense which he could clap back at me with would be to say that he didn't actually write this book. It was planted on Amazon and various distribution platforms by the Tavistock Institute in an attempt to publicly humiliate him by attaching his name to a series of incompetent moronic rantings. Because let me tell you, buddy, they really did pull a number on you with this one. Without a doubt, the most unrelenting 215 pages of stupidity I have ever read. The fact that you've plagiarized the whole thing and it still came out sounding like something my 12-year-old nephew would write is astonishing. That being said, although it's easy to laugh at Daniel and his theories, let's not forget how we got here.
Why are there so many people that are in this state of mind? And the answer to that is a process called ideological subversion, which is an agenda-driven toolkit of mind control. If you want to research this yourself, who is the Tavistock Institute and what did they have to do with the Beatles? When you look at their involvement, what you'll see is that a lot of these what we thought were organic cultural movements were actually designed by social engineers to capture the youth of America. And what they had was a long multi-generational plan to change the perception of reality for the citizens of America.
Zach Voorhees used to work at Google. He can't be that stupid. And yet, he appears to believe in the Tavistock theory 100%. And there are many more people like him. Look at some of these reviews on Amazon. The Tavistock Institute is not beneficial to Western societies. Rather, it seeks to rot mainly white and mainly Christian Western countries from within. What next, you may ask? Acceptance of incest, pedophilia, and sex with animals, making the acronym LGBTIPA? Stop them before it gets this far. Start by reading this excellent book. Another one of a slightly different tone. I've only just started reading this book on my phone. It is outstanding. I can't put it down. Many interesting facts that you wouldn't know from the mainstream media. On Daniel's Twitter feed, you can find a supporter asking him this question. Is there any way out of society's intellectual and moral decline? We are living in a time when presenting data and evidence offends people. And this is the really mad thing to me, is that these people do believe they're dealing in hard data and evidence, and that Daniel is the only one brave enough to present it. You know, there's a quote which people like to use whenever they're called upon to defend their conspiratorial beliefs which lie outside of the Overton window, and it's this: do your own research, make up your own mind. And what occurred to me whilst making this video was a big realization of how moronic the process of doing one's own research can become if left in the hands of certain people. They fabricate quotes, they read isolated text passages on blogs without reading any of the original source materials, they interpret academic theories as demonic scriptures prophesizing the fall of civilization. And you know what? There's an endless stream of blogs and web pages which exist purely to reinforce this dumb process and provide an echo chamber for those who are gullible enough to fall for the simplistic worldview they present. Passages from Daniel Estulin's Tavistock book now constitute a fairly important part of these echo chambers online. And in this realm, a man who has never read any primary source materials and who is completely scientifically illiterate can come to be seen as one of the most well-read and knowledgeable people around. From my own personal experience, I've found that the people who scream the loudest about disinformation and dishonesty are usually the ones who most frequently end up running into the arms of polemicists like Daniel Estulin. And you know what? That really defeats the whole point. You're not doing your own research by blindly accepting the prescriptions of a random blogger. You're just replacing the mainstream media with an even more dishonest vessel of misinformation. And so, while I will accept the legitimacy of the mantra, do your own research, make up your own mind, I will end this video by pointing out that there's a vital appendage which I think the slogan is missing. The new mantra which I think we all need to embrace is: do your own research, make up your own mind, but don't be fucking stupid.
Yo, come on, bro. Don't get on this stuff. Hey, yo.
Yes. If you're still here, thanks for sticking around to the end of my vid. I really appreciate it. Beaming across the screen right now is a list of the baddest peeps who send me funds on Patreon and give me the motivation I need to invest significant time and energy in reading long-ass books which I end up strongly disliking. All of these people, safe as fuck, thank you so much for the money. Especially when perhaps I don't get as many views on videos as I would have hoped for, the fact that I always get a few new peeps jumping on board my Patreon train is very encouraging and makes me feel very happy, so yeah, big ups. As I mentioned early on in the video, this particular vid was not one I originally intended to make. I heard about the Tavistock theory whilst doing research for part 4 of my long-running Project Veritas series. So then I got stuck into Daniel Estulin's book, and you know what? I didn't want to just dismissively cast the whole Tavistock theory aside by labeling it as a conspiracy theory and leaving it there. I always think that's an incredibly ineffectual way to deal with conspiracy theorists. I thought it'd be better to systematically go through its fundamental misunderstandings, and I wouldn't have had time for such an enterprise in the middle of another video about something completely different. So that's why this whole Tavistock vid became its own thing. Next time on my channel, I'll be getting back on track with my favorite character from the hardline Republican expanded universe, James O'Keefe. We'll be talking about Facebook, Google and that, and some more interesting theories about who is brainwashing us from behind the scenes. I hope everyone keeps well. Thanks again for watching my vids, and I will say bye now. Bye.
You get the bag and fumble it, I get the bag and flip it and tumble it. Straight off the lot, 300 cash, and the car came with a blood in it. Lil' mama a thot, and she got ass, then she gon' fuck up her bag. Pull up to the spot, living too fast, dropping the dope in the stash. In Italy, got 2 foreign hoes, they deal me. Draw the top, join this cold, but you feel the heat. Be real with me, keep it 100, just be real with me. Eat it up like it's a feast, they say the dope gon' fleet.
Percocet pill on me, I saw my name, baby, chill with me. Them niggas that both in the back don't say nothing, them niggas that kill for me. Back as I can on my shit, on fleek. Man, I can't spin on that batty for me. Bitch, I'm a dog in my tree. How about the frog and leap? I put them bricks in the fender. My bitch, she walk around like she Chris Jenner. I used to break in the Emma and take out running like the game of Tifa. It's simple, I play with a mental. Mama said she saw me on Jimmy Kimmel. Canada, cause I'm a money symbol. Walking with the rats, I'm looking crippled. Fuck on that bitch, then I temple. A nickel for me to take pictures. Not from LA, but I cripple. Double my cup for a triple. Boss on my body, no people could. I'm not your average or typical. Look at my wrist and it's critical. Hold it up, dropping the temperature. I get that back on the regular. I got a bag on my cellular. Back in the bag of the vegetables. Back of the cookies is medical. Cocaine, codeine, etc. Cocaine and lean is federal. I take off landing on nebula. As a natural niggas on my schedule.
You get the bag and fumble it, I get the bag and flip it and tumble it. Straight off the lot, 300 cash, and the car came with a blood in it. Lil' mama a thot, and she got ass, and she gon' fuck up her bag. Pull up to the spot, living too fast, dropping the dope in the stash. In Italy, got 2 foreign hoes, they deal me. Draw the top, join this cold, but you feel the heat. Be real with me, keep it 100, just be real with me. Eat it up like it's a feast, they say the dope gon' flee. I know these niggas get sick of me, they chase my neck cause I'm ill on peace. I don't need like a freestyle for free, I put in the key and I ride the beat. I don't need come out the house for free, I pay a nigga to drive for me. Jay-Z couldn't even go sign for me, I do what I want cause I'm signed to me. I get the bag, you get the back of the cut of the head. Stop the comparing, y'all making me laugh. Need to rehab, I'm addicted to cash. Convertible walk, convertible talk, my dope got a vertical, look at it how. And then jump out that pot, came out the jet and went straight to the car. Take it easy, baby, little of summer on freezing, baby. Don't leave me, baby, just drop to your knees and please me, baby. I'm fascinated, 2 bitches so fine that I masturbated. Congratulations, she ran so good that I graduated. They had to hate it, I'm for them niggas that plastic, baby. A trapper, baby, I rap what I own on my masters, baby. It's tragic, baby, I pull up and fuck up the traffic, baby. A savage, baby, I'm killing these niggas, cook casket, baby. slow.